Chapter 2. Be like Frank. The romantic relationship between young men and warfare is as old as time itself, regardless of what the older generation may say to discourage them due to their own lived experiences. Young men will always seek out the soldier's adventure, some for glory, some for identity. For me, I simply had nowhere else to go. Let us not forget that warfare is continually celebrated throughout all cultures, through mythology, history, religion, and even modern-day pop culture, such as cinema. These countless tales are mostly focused on uncertain young men volunteering to go to war, then becoming reluctant heroes in the process. They generally undergo trials and hardships, before almost always returning home as brave warriors, and are paraded with medals. On return, they receive newfound fame, respect, and most important of all, their new identity, the hero. This appealed to me, and I wanted all of this. I've never bought into the premise that we are all heroes in our own stories, as this subjective outlook suggests that one is unable to commit any wrongdoings. I've always been a realist, and was only too aware that even heroes have bad days and can make mistakes. Regardless of this, I was desperately seeking the hero's journey, and wanted the respect, and more so, the identity that accompanied it. The British Army, or more specifically, the Queen's Guards, offered me this. Today, if you ask me the question, do I perceive myself as a hero? My response would be unequivocally, no. I am now part of the lived generation that would discourage young men from joining the armed forces, and this is regrettably as a result of my own detrimental experiences. I am no hero, but did have the pleasure of working alongside many throughout my 20-year military journey. It is easy to associate and compare the institutional nature of a children's home to the institution of the British Army, as they share many similarities, and this would be accurate. My seed was already planted for a career in the Army, but I was still unsure about the transition. The British Army recruiting adverts of the mid-90s were focused around comradeship, extreme sports, global travel, and adventure, under the marketing slogan, "Be like Frank." I had thrived under the rigid conditions of being in an institution, and wanted to continue to do well in the future, so the Army was the obvious choice. After all, I wanted to be like Frank. It was no surprise that I was not the only soldier to successfully transition from a children's home into the Army, and it was no coincidence that this was a frequent occurrence. I had unknowingly followed the recent footsteps of John Corcoran and Jim, both from Manchester, both from children's homes, and both of whom had previously joined the Irish Guards. All three of us excelled in the military, and we all revelled in the privileges and identity that was associated within the life of the sergeant's mess. I would serve closely on operations in Baghdad in Iraq with Jim, and in Kosovo, South Armagh, and Afghanistan with John. John would become one of my closest friends, the big brother I never had, and would help guide me when I faced the many times of uncertainty and doubt. Unfortunately, John was haunted by the events of an insurgent ambush in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, and would regrettably die from cancer a few years later. John's death left me devastated. Knowing what he had survived on operations, then to be cruelly taken by cancer. I miss him daily. He was only 39 years old. On entering the Army Careers Office, Your job choices are very much made for you by the recruiting sergeant at the front desk. In my case, it was a Grenadier Guardsman. I recall how tall and methodical he was, and this bizarrely appealed to me, as I craved structure. On completing the simplest of tests called the British Army Recruit Battery, or more commonly referred to as the BARB test, I was informed that I could apply for any career path, apart from officer training, of course, due to my humble background. Before going into the careers office, every adult I knew had advised me not to join the infantry, cannon fodder, but to rather seek out an apprenticeship, a trade, a career that would be useful in later life. I had the option to train as an avionics technician, a carpenter, electrician, or even a mechanic. But I decided on the infantry, as I just wanted to fight, to be a hero. Besides, I was a scrapper. At the time, I didn't see the reasoning in joining a fighting force to be a supporting logistical role. And let's not forget, I was heavily influenced by the infantry recruiter, of course. Nowadays, I understand and appreciate the importance of all roles within the armed forces, as one cannot function without the other. But the infantry is still the best. However, this bastard of a sergeant pulled me to one side and told me that I was special and not in the "I want to take you for a meal" kind of way. He quietly explained to me that he only recruits the best for the Grenadier Guards. Proud infantrymen with a dual role who also protect the Queen. I would become the Queen's personal bodyguard. My eyes sparkled with excitement and appreciation as he put on a video of the trooping of the colour. He had me, hook, line and sinker. I'd never even been to London before, and wow, that red tunic and bearskin. It was so iconic, and seemed out of this world to me, immediately giving me a proud sense of identity. It was the Queen's Guards for me, but only if they had an Irish regiment. Hence, I was recruited to the Irish Guards, as I still wanted to make my family proud. Ironically, some years later, I would hold the same position of this recruiting sergeant, and I would use the same technique to recruit gullible souls into the Guards, having a private chuckle to myself every time this one line worked. On hearing the news, my family had immediately raised their concerns about my application due to the very real threat of the IRA and their relentless attacks on British soldiers. I was conscious of this and was very concerned about being sent to Northern Ireland, but thought to myself, what are the odds of that happening? I remember being slightly conflicted due to my strong Irish Roman Catholic upbringing, as some of my family despised the British Army. I was torn between my Irish heritage and English upbringing, so joining the Irish Guards in the British Army ticked all the boxes for me. Years later, I would discover that an abandoned building on the family farm that I had spent my summers in Ireland as a child was once used as an IRA safe house shortly after the Easter Rising. The following year, I would be on foot patrol in South Armagh, enforcing the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Awkward much. I recall that I wasn't particularly fazed by the army selection process. It was an overnight stay at a camp in Lichfield in the Midlands. This consisted of a medical, a military lesson, and finally a fitness test before an interview the following morning. I came first out of my group on the 1.5-mile run with ease. I didn't put much effort in, if I'm being honest, as I'd always been a strong runner. But then again, I had to be. Growing up in Red Salford, Manchester City fans were few and far between, and I found myself running a lot. At the final stage of the selection process was an interview. I can recall that the officer was attempting to poach me for his own regiment as he was impressed with my high levels of fitness. I still remember that he raised his concerns about my choice of selecting the Irish Guards over other infantry regiments, as I was not particularly well dressed or smart. I was wearing a borrowed shirt and tie, along with my school trousers and shoes, which I had outgrown. In fact, the shoes were not even polished and were filthy, a point that was highlighted by this selection officer. He then mentioned my long hair and questioned my suitability for the Guards. This was the mid-90s, and Oasis mania was storming the nation. I was from Manchester, so I naturally had a Liam Gallagher bonnet and the unwavering attitude to suit. Reluctantly, the selection officer passed me, despite being the scruffiest recruit there, and I was all set to join the Irish Guards. The day was set, June 15, 1996, and I was apprehensive and having doubts about my decision to join the army. Earlier that year, the IRA had bombed the London Docklands, killing 2 people in the process, and this had raised some serious qualms. The weeks prior, I'd already taken the Queen's shilling, or £15, at my attestation, where I had sworn allegiance to my Queen and country. The money was meant to be used to buy toiletries for basic training. However, my recruiting sergeant insisted that we celebrated my attestation at the pub opposite, the Shakespeare. Hence, my Queen's shilling was spent indulging my recruiting sergeant with ale, whilst I, sipping Coke, listened, intrigued, to his war stories. The day finally arrived, and I had mistakenly entrusted my travel warrant to my girlfriend at the time for safekeeping. She didn't want me to join the army either, and had conveniently lost my travel warrant to Brookwood Station in a desperate attempt to prevent me from leaving. I didn't have enough money for a replacement, and began to panic. Desperately, I packed my bags and decided to travel to Piccadilly train station in the centre of Manchester. My plan was to explain my situation to the clerk at the ticket office, show them my enlistment papers, and hopefully they could produce me a replacement ticket. If that failed, I would simply jump the train, and my mind was made up. The army was my ticket to a better life. However, getting to the station was the least of my problems. All the roads were being shut off in and around the city centre. The police wouldn't tell us what was going on, apart from insisting that it was imperative for your own safety that we followed the diversions and under no circumstances we enter the city centre. A coded bomb warning had been issued by the IRA. I didn't listen to the police, and eventually made my way through the roadblocks to about half a mile from the train station, where I encountered a mob of police officers frantically running towards us. What were they running from? I wondered. Maybe there was a bomb after all. The only road available to us to escape the city was conveniently pointed in the direction of my grandparents' house. They'd always been good to me, but at times distant, and I was hopeful that they would pay for my train ticket. They were my last option. I was out of ideas. I was just over a mile past the outskirts of the city centre when the unthinkable happened, in the form of the most deafening bang I had heard to date. The IRA had detonated a 3,300-pound bomb, the second biggest in mainland Britain, which had just decimated Manchester city centre. Moments later, I eventually stopped at my grandparents' house, which is in Longsight, just over 1.5 miles from the city centre. Everybody was in their gardens looking up to the sky. Cars had stopped in the street, and everyone was fixated on the large mushroom cloud that was now dominating the skyline. None of us could believe what had just happened. How close we were. or how lucky we'd been. It wasn't fear I felt, but rage. Manchester was my city, my home, and this attack felt personal. I was now determined more than ever to join the ranks of the British Army, to do my part in eradicating terrorism. But beforehand, I still needed some money for that train ticket. I don't know if it was the shock of the bombing, or that he just wanted rid of me, but my grandfather actually gave me some money for a replacement ticket. I found this strange, as both my grandparents were Irish through and through, and had no love for the British Army. My family, my girlfriend, and, it would seem, even the IRA had reservations about me joining the British Army. But this had made me more determined than ever. I eventually was able to catch a later train from Stockport to London Euston Station, navigate through the London Underground, then eventually find my way to Brookwood Station, and then finally to Purbright Camp. I had made it to basic training. To get to basic training, to say the least, had been a struggle. However, I had arrived late due to the IRA bombing, and may or may not have had a few cans of beer on the train on the way. I clearly remember that the remainder of the other recruits were already in a lesson in the accommodation block when I eventually arrived. They were all dressed in green boiler suits, and all looked very depressed, probably regretting their poor life choices that had led them here. It was in basic training that I became friends with Niall, a Southern Irishman from Cork. Niall was 25 years old when he had joined up, but despite the age gap, we instantly became friends. He would give me the short-lived nickname of Top Manc, as at the time, everything in Mancunian technology was top. Top one, it's on top, it's a top jacket, etc. Niall often jokes about my dramatic entrance, claiming that I bounced through the doors with northern swagger and attitude, which I find hard to believe. Everyone else had arrived on time and wearing a suit. I didn't own a suit, nor could I afford one for that matter, but instead opted for shorts, my Manchester City football shirt, rucksack casually hanging from my shoulders, with accompanying football boots dangling from the straps, of course. It was summer after all, and I wanted to be like Frank. Let us not forget that my recruiting sergeant had sold the army on the promise of sport and adventure. However, in training, this couldn't be further away from the truth. For some strange reason, my stylish entrance had enraged the sergeants who insisted on using my abs as a punch bag for a few rounds. I must point out that this was a bit of banter, and after this rather formal introduction, I quickly got dressed in my green boiler suit and joined the rest of the platoon with a depressed look, contemplating and regretting my own choice as to why I had joined the British Army. Purbright was where the Guards Division broke in and indoctrinated their new recruits. This process had been perfected over the generations, and we would be no different. Behavioural training methods and military conditioning had been perfected from the lessons learned from the Second World War and were further reinforced from the recent lessons of violent close-quarter fighting that occurred in the 1982 Falklands War. Recruit training is designed to strip civilians of their previous identity and turn them into soldiers. This begins immediately by removing all of their civilian clothing and items with the aim to segregate the individual from their previous identity. For up to 6 months, every day is mapped out for them, and recruits are told when to eat, sleep, and shit, and this forms the foundations of a codependency through routine. You are constantly shouted at, and you instantly form a shared dislike towards your training sergeants and corporals. Unknowingly, this helps to build the foundation of military teamwork through this common ground. This process subconsciously establishes a strong bond between recruits through their shared hardships and often difficult experiences. Years later, if two veterans meet up who were in training together, there is an unwritten mutual respect and bond between them that is unbreakable. Next comes the standard recruit haircut. I had already prepared myself for the recruit training by shaving my top Mancunian bonnet after receiving the negative comments from my section officer. I vividly remember watching the attitude, fight, confidence and resolve drain out of my fellow recruits as the military barber shaved off their distinctive and individual hairstyles. Oddly enough, I still had to sit in the barber's chair and go through the process, despite already having a short number 2, and unfairly, still had to pay for the privilege. Within 24 hours of this shock of capture, we were all shadows of our civilian selves, as our previous identities were stripped from us. In 1996, basic training consisted of 6 main military lessons that you were required to master within a cramped 10-week period in order to successfully pass out. Phase 2 training for the infantry was at the Infantry Training Centre, ITC, at Catterick in North Yorkshire. This consisted of a further 17 weeks of tactical and platoon weapon training, before we would finally progress onto our relevant regiments as proud trained Guardsmen. Military training was a sausage factory with a high failure and dropout rate, with new platoons of recruits starting every 2 to 4 weeks. I must point out that every subject had tests that recruits were required to pass in order to progress. If anyone failed one, or was injured, those recruits would frequently be back-squadded. This process was where recruits required remedial training and were placed in a junior platoon. More often than not, this was just 2 weeks, and although there was no shame in needing more time in mastering a new skill set, being back-squadded was perceived as a failure and weakness. Many of those who were back-squadded left the army due to this unproductive mindset. Back-squadding was also often used as a tool to motivate under-par recruits. I experienced this, as I was often reminded that my attitude was always under par. I was even threatened with the prospect of being back-squadded after asking a question regarding our flamethrower training. How was I to know that flamethrowers were now banned under the Geneva Convention? Initially, there was foot and rifle drill to master. The main aim of drill, if memory recalls, is to produce a soldier that is smart, alert, and obedient. I must point out the phrasing of the words alert and obedient, as this is not necessarily terminology associated with human behaviour, but more so on how you would train a dog. Drill is the embodiment of military discipline, and recruits are rigorously marched around the camps and drill squares until they are universally working together as a formed body of men, a unit, a team. This is the basis of teamwork, and several tests would have to be completed as a platoon before we progressed. It is also where the indoctrination process of the military begins. You are taught to react to words of command without question, without hesitation. Muscle memory and reflexes take over as you are subconsciously reprogrammed. It is interesting observing the masses of veterans on parade at Remembrance, watching how, despite the fact that they are no longer soldiers, they still know and react to the words of command without question, without hesitation, obedient. The next is skill at arms training. This is where you learn the basics about weapons and how to operate them. Everything is now a drill. Words of command are yelled, and we automatically respond. Again, without hesitation, without question. Hours are spent stripping and assembling weapons until it becomes second nature. until the weapon feels like an extension of your body. Range work is gradually introduced, and recruits are taught to shoot at targets that resemble a soldier running towards you. I can recall the endless hours of imagining who this enemy target was. What was his backstory? Why was he so angry? As I repeatedly, then over time instinctively, shot him through my sights. Eventually, shooting this lifelike human target became a reflex, as we were all conditioned to dehumanize our targets. Yet again, standards of marksmanship are required before you can progress. Good results are rewarded, and poor results punished through reward-based incentive. Other subjects included physical training, fieldcraft, map reading, first aid, and how to survive in a nuclear, biological and chemical NBC environment. Besides the detrimental military training methods that I believe restricted individual thought and had a long-term psychological impact on our mental health, we must also discuss the British Army's values and standards that were instilled into us. I have always remembered these through the acronym of SOLID C: selfless commitment, respect for others, loyalty, integrity, discipline, and finally, courage. I, like many troubled young men, needed guidance, structure, and stability, and these core values were the final part of the puzzle for the life that I desired. The two that always stand out for me are selfless commitment and integrity. The others, with the exception of respect for others, simply promote military lifestyle values. Discipline, loyalty, and courage. Respect for others always seemed important to me, and, throughout my career, I never experienced any racism due to skin color or ethnicity. As in the infantry, you were simply judged on your character and work ethic, which was, in many ways, refreshing. Sectarian racism, however, was evident throughout my career, and will be covered much later. There is no other job in the world where, on application, you essentially write a blank check for your life, other than in the military. It would be these core values that I would later use to justify my sacrifices under the narrative that I was making the world a better place, freeing the oppressed, ending tyranny. Yes, this was the case in Kosovo in 1999, and to this day, I am still immensely proud of my small contributing part there. But what about Iraq? What about the now very publicly labelled illegal war? The illegal occupation, and then, by association, the prolonged guerrilla war against the Taliban in Afghanistan. Imagine that one justifies the sacrifices of horrors of warfare through these core values, and imagine that this helps one rationalize their actions. Now strip away the integrity from the conflict and make the war illegal. How can a soldier comprehend and accept the trauma of war, one's selfless sacrifices, if the war is not just? What if the war is, in fact, illegal, and his integrity as a soldier was in question? That soldier was me. This piggybacks onto the notion that we always perceive ourselves as the hero. After all, this is our story. But what if, along the way, the narrative had changed, and somehow you became the villain? How would you cope? What would you do? Looking back, I actually enjoyed my recruit training at Pirbright, although I didn't think it at the time. The training team from Egypt platoon were firm, yet fair, and they would heavily influence many decisions throughout my career. They were under pressure to produce results from a very demanding schedule and successfully achieved this. A few years later, basic training would be extended to 12, then 14 weeks to help alleviate the pressure on both the recruits and staff. This proved to be successful and increased the retainment rate, which in turn saved the taxpayer money. I would encounter all of the members of this training team in the years to come, but would be saddened when one of them would take his own life. Another victim of a dangerous mindset that was destroying good men from the inside. The increased rate of military suicide. After a weekend break, or to be honest, just the Saturday, I arrived at Vimy Barracks at the Infantry Training Centre, Catterick, to begin my Phase 2 infantry training. I was immediately in awe of the barracks, as there was a 432 armoured fighting vehicle at the front gate, with accompanying pillar boxes at either flank. This would be a whole new adventure, and I was excited at the prospect of learning how to use the vast array of infantry weapon systems. Maybe I would get to use that flamethrower after all. Sadly not. But we were trained in hand grenades, machine guns, mortars, anti-tank weapons, and platoon tactics. And let us not forget the very infantry-relevant practice of bayonet fighting. We had incurred substantial recruit losses at Pirbright through a combination of injuries and backsquadding, and those who had just decided that the army wasn't for them. As a result of these low numbers, we had merged with the platoon that was ahead of us at Pirbright. We were a little jealous, though, as these guys were just returning from 2 weeks' leave, whereas we had our passing out parade on Friday and were now starting at Catterick on the Sunday. By now, I had also bought a cheap suit. I had learned my previous lesson, and I wanted to make a good first impression with my new training team. Together, we would form 19 Platoon, part of the Guards Training Company, and would be competing side by side with a sister platoon from the Parachute Regiment in fitness, marksmanship, and drill for regimental bragging rights. From day one, our new training team had a superiority complex in comparison to those from Egypt Platoon at Pirbright. From their perspective, everything that we had previously been taught was either not up to standard or just completely incorrect. They would complain about how shite our previous instructors were, and how it was up to them to reteach everything on top of their already busy workload. I didn't buy into this, due to the fact that they were basically saying that we were not good enough to pass out of Phase 1 training and didn't deserve to be at the ITC. Needless to say, I didn't particularly enjoy my Phase 2 infantry training, and at times, the training team of 19 Platoon was simply cruel and exploitative. This new training team were also very physical, and were not afraid to throw their weight around, with many of us being punched and kicked along the way. On top of this, they would charge us to use cleaning materials, and even the electric hoovers had a weekly surcharge. We were even pressured to buy these crooks a present at the end of our training as a token of our unwavering gratitude. Years later, when I was in their position as a training sergeant, I was adamant that my recruits never bought me anything for simply doing my job, although I did let some of them buy me a pint after they'd passed out. I never thought that I'd been indoctrinated or reprogrammed in Phase 1 basic training, as I never felt that it was necessarily that challenging. Then there is the word association with the word basic to consider. If something is basic, then one would automatically assume that it cannot be that harmful or have any long-term damaging effects. In this case, the basic foundations of the military mindset had been laid. The physical and mental challenges of infantry training would build, then feed on this, and would culminate with bayonet fighting training at Catterick. Close-quarter combat is brutal and unforgiving and is best avoided. However, we must remember that our infantry training was primarily focused on the brutality that had occurred at the Falklands War. Besides, the British Army's ethos was to train hard, to fight easy. And we thrived at training hard. Infantry soldiers can only carry so much ammunition. Therefore, it is imperative that they can still be combat effective with just the use of their bare hands and bayonets. Soldiers are taught to dehumanize the enemy, as this makes killing that much easier. Engaging an enemy through a rifle scope at a distance isn't personal, but at close quarters, this is personal. Face to face. This is brutal. This is a different kind of warfare. This is bayonet fighting. Even now, writing this, my hands are trembling, and my mouth has gone dry. Not due to the thought of training for warfare, but rather being reminded of my own very real experiences from real operational tours. At this point in our training, we had been taught that pain is weakness, emotions are weakness, and we had been pushed to and beyond what we perceived as our mental and physical limits. I suppose we were finally like machines that would react emotionlessly, without thought or hesitation. Bayonet fighting training taps into all of this, but allows you to finally vent all of the suppressed emotions and anger. Our instructors would psych us up in preparation by yelling, "What's a bayonet for?" And we would aggressively and barbarically reply, "To kill." Then on the simple word of command, "High port!" you were expected to revert back to your calm self, machine-like. On receipt of the command, "On guard!" then, "Advance!" Soldiers are required to advance on stuffed dummies, then brutally and aggressively impale them, simulating killing another human being up close in the process. Through repetition and behavioural training, this becomes your new normal, and some soldiers actually grow to enjoy it. These dummies, depending on the creativity of the training team, would be filled with wallpaper paste mixed with red food dye, straw, or even meat scraps from a local butcher for added simulation and effect. You would then proceed to lanes where you would run, crawl, and climb over obstacles, through streams, and almost always uphill, to kill these dummies with your bare hands, simulating close-quarter fighting. This type of training made us emotionally numb and zombie-like. I recall a short trainee Scots Guardsman unknowingly impaling his own bayonet through his thigh whilst crawling through this lane, completely oblivious to the pain. The training teams had successfully pushed him to both his physical and psychological limits, and now he was fully indoctrinated into the infantry mindset. Fearless, emotionless, questionless. This, from my experience, was the final phase of my military conditioning, and this had been successfully achieved through gradually changing my psychological mindset, through repetitive behavioural learning. The term controlled aggression was often used to describe such training methods. To be able to go from calm to killer, then revert back to calm again, at a simple command. How does one go from civilian to a mindless killer on command in less than a 6-month period? What structures need to be in place for an individual to be able to accept, then cope with this? What would be the lasting effects on the mental health in creating my generation of infantry soldiers? I believe that it was the suppression of our emotions that allowed us to achieve this. But ask the question, What are the negative long-term implications associated with this type of training? From a 2013 Ministry of Defence study, it was found that infantry units have traditionally promoted aggression as a desirable trait, and such units frequently recruit individuals who are socially disadvantaged and likely to have low educational attainment. This would suggest that the British Army purposefully and deliberately recruited infanteers from adverse backgrounds who were poorly educated, as these were easily conditioned. Alternatively, due to their low educational attainment, perhaps the infantry was their only option. Regardless, this raises a pertinent question about what happens to these soldiers on discharge, and is there a de-escalation of this process to revert them back into a civilian mindset? It is no secret that soldiers, a product of their training and operational experiences, are emotionally numb and lack empathy. Bearing this in mind, it comes as no surprise that many of them, like myself, marry nurses who are the emotional opposite. We were taught not to show emotions, but rather to suppress them, and this has had a detrimental effect on our relationships and families. Eventually, by hiding, avoiding, and denying these emotions, something has to give. Imagine that soldiers' emotions are a pressure cooker, but constantly operating at a subconscious 80 to 90% pressure level. This allows them, through the use of controlled aggression, to conduct training exercises such as bayonet fighting, where they can easily reach, then vent, 100% of their raw suppressed emotions through controlled aggression. I fundamentally believe that controlled aggression has been detrimental to all aspects of both our soldiers' and veterans' emotional outlook, as through military conditioning, they were deemed weak if they were to seek help. If it had taken 6 months to train us to act and think in a specific way, I ask the question yet again, why was there no mirroring training offered on return to the civilian sector? This would help to go a long way to explain why soldiers and veterans are victims of such high suicide rates, and why trivial things cause them to emotionally explode. Before the bayonet fighting training had commenced, we were tormented throughout the night by being kept awake to perform mediocre tasks, then pushed to our physical limits through arduous exercise until we were physically and mentally exhausted. Then, and only then, would the bayonet fighting be allowed to begin. I am all too aware that warfare is a dirty place, and there is no black or white. Additionally, you cannot have an effective fighting force that reflects society, as what soldiers are required to do is not accepted within the laws of our society. Yet once our service ends, there has been, and continues to be, a lack of emotional and psychological training to help us understand our mindset, and it is our families who are left to pick up the pieces. When you speak about the concept of indoctrination, one automatically associates this concept with a cult. However, on the 1st of December 1996, on the drill square at Vimy Barracks, Niall and myself would have our first encounter with death. Private Brian Isherwood, a trainee with the Black Watch, and only 19 years old at the time, would purposefully patrol across the parade square, hallowed ground in military terms and not to be crossed unless participating in drill. Isherwood gazed directly at us, put his rifle in his mouth, and blew his brains out to our immediate front. As the rifle ranges were close by, the sound of gunshots was a familiar occurrence. But this happened right in our line of sight. less than 20 meters away from us. And we didn't move a muscle. This was not out of fear, or shock for that matter, but because we were diligent trainee guardsmen, and whilst standing to attention on parade, it was indoctrinated into us that we didn't move a muscle. I recall that our platoon sergeant, a fierce grenadier guardsman, was giving us final instructions before our pass-out parade later that week. He had put the fear of God into us throughout the past 17 weeks of our infantry training, and we were terrified of the consequences of interrupting him whilst he spoke. Time appeared to stand still whilst we were watching this horrendous situation unfold. Both our platoon and drill sergeants had their back to the now deceased Private Isherwood and were unaware of what had taken place, until eventually I found the courage to mumble the word, "Sergeant," to get his attention. The immediate response for interrupting our platoon sergeant was that he was going to bite my face off. But before he could, trainee guardsman McLaughlin also spoke up. The rest is a bit of a blur, as our sergeants attempted futile first aid. I do recall that Isherwood had died instantly, as the impact from the bullet at such close range had left a gaping hole in the side of his head. Yet oddly enough, I can still clearly see that one of his eyeballs, including the optic nerve, appeared unscathed, almost like an escape pod that had landed several meters away from his body. It's only now, reflecting back on this event, that it has the appropriate human and empathic effect that was absent at the time. Niall remembers our platoon sergeant unsuccessfully attempting to secure Private Isherwood's skull with his bare hands, whilst concurrently screaming, "You dirty bastard!" as brain matter, blood and bone poured all over him. I don't believe that this was an insult aimed towards Isherwood, but more of a coping mechanism to help him deal with what was occurring in his bare hands. I don't know what drove Private Isherwood to such desperate measures, but I do recall how little this fazed me at just 17 years old. What concerns me now, with the luxury of retrospect, is why a platoon of almost 30 trained soldiers chose collectively to refuse to flinch when another human being had committed suicide right before them. As a platoon, we had wholeheartedly bought into the concept of the Queen's Guards. We were so disciplined on parade that not even this dreadful event would deter us, or maybe we had, effortlessly, been subconsciously indoctrinated into the mindset of the British Army. Now looking back, I cannot help but wonder if this was the way in which we were trained, the way we were taught to suppress our emotions. Had this type of behavioural reprogramming had a hand in his death? Documents obtained by the Northern Echo, who stated that between 1994 and 2003, there had been 23 reported deaths at Catterick, 5 of them being suicides. Many of these were training accidents, yet I find myself asking the question, could these suicides have been prevented? And what was the catalyst? Was the way they were being trained, conditioned, and programmed in any way attributable to these deaths? Whilst serving, soldiers committing suicide was a common occurrence. Corporal of Horsewall, one of my instructors for basic training, hanged himself in 2004. An article would claim the added pressures of parking fines were a contributing factor to his death. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Shaw, Irish Guards, shot himself in 2013 due to the ongoing pressures of work. Then there are those who had left the armed forces, who unfortunately decided to take their own lives. This list is too long to mention. But these lost heroes were soldiers, friends, husbands, fathers, my brethren, many hiding their pain from the world until their untimely deaths. It is the vast number of suicides that has and continues to occur that has motivated me to write this book, to ask the difficult questions about how military training, life and operational experiences affected our psychological makeup. Why are so many veterans killing themselves? When I was diagnosed with PTSD in 2017, I felt ashamed, weak. However, I was very vocal about my struggle, as I believed that speaking openly about my internal battles would encourage others to seek help. Several of my military friends informed me that they had always perceived me as being mentally robust, that I was the last person they thought would ever have any issues with their mental health. This is exactly the point. I had struggled almost daily for 20 years, but had managed to hide my pain from the world. And if I was successfully doing this, then other veterans and serving personnel were certainly doing the same. When recently discussing Isherwood's suicide with Niall, who, let's not forget, was 25 years old at the time, we are both horrified at our lack of reaction. More so Niall, as with vast life experience under his belt, he is baffled at how he was unknowingly and unwillingly indoctrinated by military training. When asking the difficult questions of why didn't we react, why didn't we move, and most importantly, why didn't this bother us, I refer back to the term cult. We had been successfully reprogrammed over the period of 6 months to act, feel, and respond differently than civilians, and had successfully transitioned into soldiers. So maybe this was our final test. No counselling was offered, as these were different times, and I would hope that, in today's modern army, this is not the case. Regardless, our training was now complete, and we were fully fledged guardsmen, and a new adventure of battalion life awaited. And that's all that mattered to us. This well-oiled and drilled training cycle is a repeating cycle that is derived by the concept of reward-based incentive and would continue to be exploitative throughout all aspects of my military life. We were more focused and driven on attaining the rank and identity of a guardsman than reacting to a fellow trainee's, a fellow soldier's, suicide. This pattern of attainment is consistent throughout military life. Let me elaborate. Once you complete Phase 1 training, you are rewarded with a pass-out parade. Your family and friends attend the parade and show their appreciation of your hard work, and you receive a new identity and a new rank. You are now no longer a recruit, but a trainee guardsman. This gives you purpose and sets out a new set of goals to achieve. Once your training is complete, this pattern continues. You work hard and may get selected for promotion in rank. You go on operations and are rewarded with a medal. Once indoctrinated into this reward-driven mentality, you justify personal sacrifice as a means to an end. You buy into the concept that the Army's needs are far more important than your own. let us not forget that we are selfless in our very nature, and this is one of our core values. This would explain the high divorce rate amongst soldiers, as they always prioritize work over their families and social lives. Then there are the two types of career soldiers that tend to do exceptionally well within infantry battalions, both enlisted and commissioned, to consider. How does this often toxic environment affect them? There are enlisted soldiers like me, often from complex, broken homes, to analyze. These types of soldiers need that approval from a figure of authority, which is generally derived from childhood abandonment issues. The Army also provides much-needed stability and purpose for such soldiers, but more significantly, a new identity. An identity that commands immediate respect in both civilian and military environments, as, regardless of rank, there is always someone beneath you in the pecking order. Then, if you work hard and do well, you receive a good annual report as a reward. You earn the approval of a respected figure of authority that you crave, and may also gain a new improved identity through promotions. You climb the ranks and get introduced initially to the corporal's mess. Then, if lucky enough, the holy grail of the sergeant's mess. You experience frequent formal black-tie balls and are waited on daily at mealtimes. This is 1,000,000 miles away from that poverty-ridden council estate in Manchester, and the notion of work hard, sacrifice, earn your reward is paying off. I justified my personal sacrifice through status, the importance of self-importance. Maybe I should coin the term military Darwinism, as when you progress through rank structure, it is very much survival of the fittest. I was very much testament to this, as once I was injured, my progression ceased, and I was overlooked for promotion by more physically capable soldiers. However, this approach establishes an unbalanced and misguided codependency, with the individual totally committed to the needs of the military. In my case, for example, I was fit, loyal, and determined to get whatever job completed regardless of the cost to my personal life. I genuinely believed the Army was my life, and, as such, I would unknowingly prioritize its needs above all else. Even whilst fighting a life-changing injury, I was determined to please, to make my superiors proud, to progress and earn my reward, the rank of warrant officer. But then, my injury had taken its toll, and I was, unsurprisingly, cast aside. Now there are commissioned soldiers to analyse. These are generally well-educated and from the mid to upper class within British society, or when we mention the Guards, the aristocracy. Although not from the rough council estates, in fact quite the polar opposite, these commissioned soldiers quite often share the same subconscious need for approval due to their own abandonment issues. However, these are not from abusive households or broken homes, but rather from the more stable upper-class affluent sections of society. The only negative side of this is that they often send their children to boarding schools due to family traditions or rites of passage. The absence of parents for long periods could potentially establish a codependency towards Army life, similar to that of the less fortunate enlisted soldiers. The same needs for approval of a consistent authority figure, and the need for the same cycle of working hard, sacrifice, and reward. The only difference is that they have an established social identity before and after their service, which makes the transition to civilian life that much easier. Yet, regardless of this pre-military identity, once part of the same military indoctrination machine, they are very much like the enlisted soldier, consumed by it. When you consider that enlisted infantry soldiers undergo over 6 months of training to transition into the military mindset, commissioned soldiers at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, RMAS, participate in 12 months training before they are commissioned as officers and before they undertake their infantry training. This raises one important question. Why is there no training available for veterans to be psychologically prepared for return to civilian life? When I served, the fundamental purpose of infantry training was to prepare civilians mentally for warfare, to give them the skills that would enable them to ultimately close with and engage the enemy at close quarters in order to bring about the enemy's defeat. The aim was to transform them from weak civilians into what was commonly referred to as lean, green killing machines, the key word here being kill. Again, I ask the question, where was the de-escalation training to prepare us for civilian life? Niall, who successfully reached the rank of Warrant Officer Class 2, put this into perspective when he said that on leaving the British Army after 24 years, he felt like he was being stripped naked to his very core. One day you were suppressing your emotions, many from your battlefield exploits. Your outlook is through the prism of your military status. Then the following day, this identity is taken away. Where are all these caged emotions supposed to go? And what are you to do with them? Many, including myself, simply carried on as normal, pretending that we were okay, and denied their very existence. From my personal experience, by doing such, my deteriorating mental health manifested and fed on this. From the outside, I looked and pretended that I was fine. But internally, I was very conscious that something was seriously wrong. I was in pain, but too embarrassed and proud to seek help. Reflecting back on our training experiences, by no means am I attempting to point the blame at any of the training staff for doing their jobs that they were trained to do. Rather, I am attempting to analyze and understand the long-term psychological impact that recruit training has on the individual. It comes as no surprise that recruit training has to be both physically and mentally demanding. In many ways, it is also a cultural transformation. The process introduces you to a completely new environment, a unique and violent world within itself. Let us not forget the importance of the concept of identity, as this process is designed to change your mentality and thought process, and this can be extremely traumatic and detrimental to the individual's long-term mental health. Soldier G, another veteran from my generation, described this process as being beaten into submission. After all, the purpose of basic training is to break the individual down and rebuild them into what the British Army requires of them. Having been through this process, and then some years later being on the other side of the looking glass as a recruit trainer myself, I can confidently refer to this process as indoctrination. Now, many years later, I find myself asking the questions, where does the soldier stop and the civilian begin? Was this process of behavioural learning in any way responsible for creating the psychological instability that allows PTSD to thrive? I am by no means a psychiatrist, nor do I have any qualifications regarding the study of mental health. I am merely asking these questions from my own experiences. Still, why is there not an equivalent process available when you leave the forces? Why is there no effort made to reverse this harmful, destructive process and mentality? Where is the aftercare? Where is the support? Maybe I expect too much from a society that sent me to war. A society that trained me to conduct and witness inhuman acts. The worst that mankind has to offer. I will never be able to entirely revert back to a civilian mentality after witnessing the horrors of war. But perhaps a little help to understand how to transition back from a soldier to this society would have been appreciated.